this conversation is about government, and we've heard quite a bit about government here. A lot of very cheerful, optimistic talk about all the amazing things. Local, state, federal, this, that, international cooperation, everything's just perfect, right? What we want to do in this conversation is just try to get really practical, though. So we've got particular companies. Some tend to be a little bit more focused in one country. Some are completely international or regional and things like this. And we want to get into the practicalities, really, of working with government. We've heard a lot of what government is giving, but do we hear what we need? Now, there's a lot of conversation with this, but also, like anything else, things that end up being negotiations. We wanted this, but gosh, it didn't make it into the final plan, right? And things like this. There have also been like G7 reports and things like this, and saying, oh, we're all amazing, great friends, and we're all going to get together and do the most obvious things you would expect us all to do with this, right? There's nothing controversial, right? This. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're going to systematically work through this. I'm going to save a couple of little bit tougher but polite conversations toward the end about this. We absolutely, or let me say, I certainly feel government has a big role in this. People talk about public-private partnerships, small companies. We talk about governments helping them through the valley of death, so to speak, right? So lots to be said with this, but I will be quiet for a moment and let you introduce yourselves. And well, you started like yesterday, you were NVIDIA, and now you're like NVIDIA Intel, kind of?
I'll just introduce myself. So I'm Nick Harrigan. I work on the messaging and what we say and what we think about quantum computing at NVIDIA. And yeah, so we're a big company, of course, but we're really interested in quantum computing, and it's a really natural fit for us. We're interested in changing what people can do with compute. And so we work across the whole quantum ecosystem and across the world, trying to give people the tools that they need to build the quantum computers we all want, and we kind of have a vision for how we're going to be there at the end as well in a large-scale useful quantum computer.
Okay. Yes, hello. My name is Mikko Nurminen, Chief Sales Officer at Bluefors. Bluefors is a pretty old company already in the quantum perspective. Founded in 2008, has been kind of supporting the quantum evolution ever since. We are the leading provider for the cryogenics measurement infrastructure solutions, and we are truly a global company. But now when in US, our revenue globally is like a $250 million a year. Half of that roughly comes from US. We have 700 people, 1/3 of that is in US, so I think US is a very significant market. But I think in this context we are discussing today, so let's discuss the global perspective as well, not only the US one.
Good afternoon, everyone. Tommaso Macri from Quera Computing. Quera is a quantum computing company that builds and productizes quantum computers based on neutral atoms, which is considered by many one of the most promising modalities to execute complex algorithms on quantum devices. We are based in Boston. We started as a spin-off of Harvard and MIT, and now we grew not only nationally but also internationally. We have 2 offices, one in Japan and the other one in the UK.
So now let's get to some basic definitions. So it's easy enough just to say government. I live in a village in upstate New York, and let me tell you, the village cares nothing about quantum computing. Right? The town cares nothing, and actually the county cares nothing. But New York State, they care quite a bit. I was with IBM for many years, and there was a very large group here in Washington, K Street, government relations. It's a nice way of saying lobbyists, right? And things like this. And there are many, many interactions with governments, of course, that go well beyond quantum. All sorts of bills that are passed, and taxes, and people, and things like this. But focusing kind of on this quantum side, let's just start with how NVIDIA interacts with governments, and at what level.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so I mean, there's, I think, a lot of important roles government can play in helping quantum computing, and I think that kind of determines the scale of governmental entity that is most usefully thinking about quantum. And I think that depends around the world. It changes around the world. So the US is a great example where I think we see a lot of state-level involvement in quantum computing. And the reason I think it falls out at that level is because it seems like regional ecosystems are emerging in which quantum computing is developing, and I think that sets the scale, if you like, for where we find government involved. And so we at NVIDIA, we work with government at all scales, but we're especially interested in where we can bring tools that can be used by like a whole community. And in fact, we see like when we do that at the state level or with the national labs, that we actually find like ecosystems building up around those tools. And so when we bring AI supercomputing to those areas, we find like local companies cluster around them, and it kind of accelerates that region. And of course, in other parts of the world, that could even be at like the country level. So where I'm from is maybe considered a state in America. I will never be allowed back in if I say that. But it's you know, it's a smaller place, and so it seems to be more that you have like the National Quantum Computing Center, and there are more sort of country level ecosystem building strategies there.
Yeah, I would say that very much echoing what Nicholas was just saying, that I think there are so many levels that we need to collaborate with the governments, so that certainly we are working with the government relationships as well on Blueforce side, in the US and in other countries as well. But then where the action is happening is typically in the US, of course, on state or even kind of on the county level, so that there you can kind of get concrete results. End of the day, yes, we are doing business as well, so that you need to be able to find that opportunity there. But in order to play really the kind of a long-term game, the strategic growth for the quantum, I think we need to start from the national level, making sure that the national relationships are on good enough shape, and then step-by-step focus from there towards the local ecosystems. And that's, I think, where most of the actual business is then happening. So all the different levels, they have a role, they are very important, and especially making sure that the quantum industry starts to explode.
The other point, perhaps, just to complement what has been said, is probably the role of coordination, coordinating all these efforts, both internally within the companies, which is very important. So, for example, when we talk to federal government, state government, local government, we need to understand who will be focusing their efforts, especially for small companies. This could be extremely challenging when they start, when you have just a few employees. These activities can really take a long time. There is another aspect of coordination, which can take place at the international level. So right now, for example, we have 2 offices overseas. Again, a lot of effort in understanding what the other governments really want or what they expect and what we can do together. And this is actually not easy at all. So, and when we talk about federal, state, and local, this applies, again, not only in the US, but also in Japan, in the UK, etc. So I think this is really a very intensive effort that can take a lot of time and a lot of management efforts as well, Bob.
So last year at this conference, I chaired a 3-hour workshop, which is a very long time, by the way, I will say, on the title was Why Quantum Computing Needs an Apollo Program. And the idea was 1961, US President John F. Kennedy said, we will go to the moon by the end of the decade. Now, of course, this is in the framework of the Cold War and Sputnik and things like this. And one way or another, dominance of the world. Yet, nevertheless, in 8 years, the United States, we did send people to the moon, and they added got back safely. It's interesting, NASA engineers actually came up with a definition of what it means to get back safely, like probability-wise of what this means. But this was an example of industrial policy. This was a government stepping in and saying, we have a clear goal, right? And in fact, it was a goal where you could kind of point up in the sky and say, see that place? We're going to go there, and then we're going to turn around, we're going to come home. It's a little murkier with, let's say, quantum computing, right? We talk about all these different ways of getting advantage, this, that, and whatever. But nevertheless, I think part of the role of government is now and should be related to industrial policy, right? We don't necessarily just need a lot of fragmented programs with the hope that maybe it'll all come together, right? So NVIDIA is a large company, right? Your independent companies, your suppliers, and things like this. So kind of turning this around, so why do you need their help, right? Is it the funding? Is it tax abatements? what aspect of it do you really feel is most valuable to you? Again, we'll start with
Yeah,
you.
sure. So actually this is, as Tommaso was talking, this is something that I thought was really relevant about the different layers of government. So federal government, for example, playing a role like that, which is perhaps a little less, like a more indirect way of mission setting, like you're talking about in the Apollo mission, which is, for example, like the DARPA QBI program, which is assessing different approaches to quantum computing for internal government, I guess, visibility. But also it does a really good job at the same time of kind of setting the conversation about what might matter in quantum computing, and by sort of giving everyone an idea about by what DARPA cares about, what people might be shooting for. And so I think that's a really important role government can do, which isn't about necessarily giving money, but giving direction, and not even necessarily just coordinating specific companies or efforts very directly, but just setting the conversation and pointing it in the right direction. And I think that program has done a great deal to help what we now see, which is a real focus on like larger scale, logical qubits, fault tolerance. And that would have happened inevitably, I think, anyway, but it was really interesting to see that program be a precursor for that in some ways.
And I would add, I think there were 18 companies that ultimately got into this quantum benchmarking initiative. And then every single one of them did a press release, right, and sometimes things like this. But what I will add is it's hard work. I've been talking to one company, and it's like massive reports that are due really soon, going into this. So lest you think this is just a high level, oh, we love you guys, here's some money. These people are working for their money. It's a real thing to do this. Okay, so same kind of question. What are you really looking for? What will help? What will ease the way? Yeah. Maybe even beyond the usual suspects.
Yeah, that's a very good question. First of all, I just have to say that I really like this Apollo kind of a comparison there now, because we just on Tuesday announced that we will actually go together with a company called Interloon to Moon and fetch the helium-3 from there back to Earth safely. So I think that's a very good reference in that sense. But I think it really kind of gets back to the kind of actual, so to say, resources what's needed to kind of bring the quantum forward, starting from the education. I think government, of course, has a big role in that one to define that what type of educational programs there are. And in order to scale the quantum, I think there needs to be more and more, whether it's engineers or physicists, to be educated. Mm-hmm. So I think that's one aspect there. I think where they can truly add value is creating the ecosystem, so helping the ecosystems to be formed as well. Especially for those quantum developers who need to have the kind of a clear physical premises, who are developing the hardware side of it. I think they need to have the premises, buildings, laboratories, and all that available.
Facilities. Yeah.
Facilities, all that available. And when they are close proximity to each other, so I think then the ecosystem starts to foster, and the ideas are kind of getting better and better all the time, and then breakthroughs will happen. I think those are important things that the government can do. Then, of course, I think today's world, the sort of a nationalistic thinking is picking up more and more, and I think the governments truly should be fighting that one, i.e. for the quantum, the collaboration is the key to success. I think it's not yet the time to start to optimize that, hey, I'm, so to say, owning exactly this winning path and not anyone else would have access to that one. Mm-hmm. We need to first get the kind of several further breakthroughs in the quantum still, and then might be a different situation, but I think for the time being, in order to reach the end goal, the utility level of the quantum computing, I think we need to be able to collaborate globally.
Tommaso?
So I would certainly double down on the role of education. If we don't have good people, we cannot really build good companies or great companies, and this is true worldwide. So this is the first thing. In a sense, we are kind of lucky in Boston, because when we first started the company, we can rely on the big talent pool of Harvard, MIT, the great universities that we have there. But as soon as you go out of this small paradise, then things can change and are actually very heterogeneous. So we are actually seeing this in the other international ecosystems we are working with. The other element that I would like to highlight is the role of these advisory roles that companies can offer to local or federal governments in order to shape programs. Sometimes when we apply for an opportunity, we just see the end result of an effort that is just internal to a working group within the government. But sometimes this does not really respond or offer any solution to the quantum companies. So I think that before preparing the programs, it would be very interesting and very wise for governments, whatever governments we're talking about, to start speaking to the ecosystem, and I go back to the second point that you mentioned, Miko, in order to maximize the usefulness of these approaches. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, sometimes this can be really a waste of time for both companies and governments, waste of money, waste of time, and so on.
I had a chance during this last year to visit one of the facilities at the UK National Quantum Computing Center. And it was a lab. It was a company that was installing a quantum computer, let's say on an optical table, just leave it at that level. What a beautiful facility. I mean, you know, they were so happy to be there because everything was state of the art, right? And they think, well, if we had to build this ourselves, right, you know, we wouldn't have access to these gases. We'd have to do all this construction. We'd have to do things like this. And it really acted as an accelerant, right, in this way that they could move in, they could do this. Now, on the other hand, though, I will say there were a lot of rules. They were not allowed to, like, screw something to the wall without getting approval from it. So the whole thing was getting a good relationship with him. But it went a very long way in this response. So let's talk a little bit about supply chain. And this will affect you in different ways. Sometimes you'll be you may not be part of a supply chain right now, but maybe eventually you will be, right? If you're not. Supply chains are tough, right? And let me just say, with geopolitical issues at various times, you know, having secure supply chains across borders, governments are doing different things, right? And so there can be a notion of sovereignty. Like, thank you very much, I'm going to make sure these parts are available and made in my country, right? And things like this. Can you talk a little bit more about that relationship and how it affects you? You know, so specifically either being part or having a supply chain. So certainly NVIDIA is both, right? What does this mean internationally? So, you know, because you are a global company, obviously.
Yeah, of course. And so for us, specifically with quantum, what we want to do, as I sort of alluded to earlier, is put the tools in the hands of the people trying to do research in quantum computing and thinking further ahead about hybrid systems where they need to experiment with connecting quantum hardware to a supercomputer or like running applications on both of those kinds of hardware in a co-located facility. And so for that, we're very lucky that we can work with places all over the world. So in some sense, in quantum, we are able to be entirely global. Exactly what you said is true, right? That there's these sovereign quantum programs that I think are emerging even more, and it's becoming more siloed in some ways between different countries and different places. But I think that we, in some ways, have managed to maintain ourselves as a kind of connective tissue between all of that, just through the nature of what we do being available. And also, I mean, given that, you know, for people to develop on these large systems, echoing back to what we were just talking about, it's something government can do in terms of to develop at that scale and explore it. Most companies aren't going to buy a superpod, like a huge supercomputer. And so it really makes sense for that to come in at like state or federal level to make those resources available to a wide range of companies. And we do that in different regions around the world. So I've totally not answered your question in a way that I think there's a point that it's nice to be able to connect together those different regions. And I think that supercomputing is a good technology that does that.
I think that's a great supercomputing, HPC. Yeah. A lot of things in the quantum industry are following that example, even like export controls, right? Which governments tend to have a little bit of opinion on, right?
Yeah. Certainly I think the export controls are there and they are influencing the industry already big time, and I think that has been the fact already for past 2, 3, 4 years, and I think that's one of the aspects. If you take kind of a very practical examples, the measurement infrastructure, i.e. the wiring practically for the quantum computing, it well can be that the best and the only kind of suppliers for some superconducting wiring might be in Japan, best and maybe only acceptable supplier for some attenuators might be in the US, and the kind of skill set to combine that to kind of a real measurement infrastructure might be only in Finland, as an example. And then when you start to kind of push the supply chains to be 100% it's local, 100% it's national level, so I think then you start to miss the best of breed, and I think that will simply slow down the development of the quantum. And I think that's a bit of the question, that when is then the right time to start to put more and more efforts on the kind of localizing the supply chain, and what would be the sort of alternatives that how to work more in a collaborative manner between the allies, and making sure that, hey, that's sort of a, how should I say, good enough, instead of having it on your own turf or in your own backyard.
And I'll add too, when we talk about quantum computers, let's say specifically, we focus so much on quantum processing units, qubits. Right? There's so many adjacent technologies. I mean, there's cooling, there are cables, basic things like this. And one very wise investor at a conference I was at several years ago said, yeah, okay, we all look at the quantum computing companies, but look at the ones around them, right? The cooling vendors. When you go to very big conferences, the Open Compute Platform coming up next month in California, there's like Chevron. Like an ExxonMobil, what are they doing, right? Well, they produce fluids for cooling traditional data centers. So as we think about this, I'll make the statement that it's not just about the QPUs, right, or the GPUs or something like this. It's about everything else, and government is going to be involved with that. So
yeah, for a company like ours, of course, this applies to laser systems, optical elements, and so on. So we work with our qubits are neutral atoms, but the control system for neutral atoms are essentially lasers and optical elements. And some of these components are actually only produced in countries like China. Mm-hmm. And sometimes this is also connected to the fact that certain critical materials, minerals, etc., can only be found there. So it's definitely not an easy thing to solve, even if we try to establish policies that try to incentivize, to create incentives for companies to establish within the US or within countries that are allied to the US, they're partners to the US. Mm-hmm. Because sometimes there is really no way to build those devices that are part of the supply chain for certain technologies that are either related to the building of the QPU or adjacent to the building of the QPU. So I think that in general I have no easy answer to this question, Bob. And it's a problem that has to be solved, that it has to be approached with a bigger lens, I think.
Mm-hmm. So I didn't put this in the list, but I'm going to ask you, because we touched upon this. QWERA, let me pick on you. You yes. recently got a fair amount of money. We're almost done, don't worry.
I was getting a call.
Just check. No, we got 90 minutes, don't worry. You've done very well in your fundraising, but you're yes. still a relatively small company.
Right.
I worked for IBM, don't worry, we had 300-something thousand people, right? But on a lot of these factors, you need to band together, right? You need to have industry associations. You can't do it yourself. Yes. So can you talk a little bit about the role of those, of working with other companies, or maybe the QWC, or in Europe there's
of course.
QUIC and so forth?
Or working with NVIDIA, maybe, for example, no? I mean, maybe the title of this panel could be what could quantum companies, what quantum companies need from NVIDIA, for example. NVIDIA is partnering with everyone, right? So I think definitely, organizations like QWC are critical. We're working very closely with them, with the big companies, of course, as well. I think they have an important role, not only in defining what are, for example, the standards for this technology, which is clearly critical, but also to establish a solid network of potential collaborators, partners, or customers more down the road. For example, I mean, we were involved actually in 2025 in a number of activities and events that were organized by QWC, and Nick was part of one of them, one of those delegations. We traveled together to Australia. And that was extremely useful, for example, to understand what the local ecosystem needs, what do they expect from companies like QWERA, for example, what are the paths to potentially opening an office there, What are the opportunities in terms of commercial deployments or collaborations with the local universities? So I think these are all critical, essential parts of the interactions of a company, even as small as QWERA today.
And I will say that's an important consideration. I think a lot of times, for me, it's easy to say, well, you all have products to sell.
Right.
What does this mean to sell things to, within a particular country? What does it mean to be part of a supply chain? But yes, setting up offices and setting up plants, I mean, there's a lot of red tape that has to go on, right, in these types of things. And as we've talked about. All right, so we have a few minutes left. So I got two questions. These are the two at the end. And let me just say them out loud, and I'm going to make this optional. You don't have to name names, but I'll give you what the questions are. Where has government support been missing or not worked in the past? I think that's one a little bit easier. Like, good intentions, but it didn't quite work out. And then the other one is, how much government help is too much help? And I'm going to take export controls off the table because people sometimes would rather just not deal with that. But these ideas of just looking in the past, let me say, where government has tried to help, but maybe in the quantum world, or at least how we've involved, how can they work better, or how do they realize now they can work better? So.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things where I'm not sure if I'd make the accusation that it has happened this way in the past, but it is possibly a pitfall that we could avoid. And one is not bringing up the whole ecosystem, so going too focused. I think it's personally too early to sort of call a modality, for example, in quantum computing. And so I think being accommodating of everyone in the ecosystem is an easy thing to not do, no matter how well-intentioned you are. And I think that's a constant act of diligence from governments and from entities that have that kind of level of influence. So I think that's a huge one. I also think being forward-looking, which is more difficult than it sounds. So there's a lot of great research that's been done around systems we have now, and that should not stop. But also, a lot of, I think, the government's most important roles are to do with the issues around scaling and issues that are hard for companies to tackle without government support, and that really make a lot of these projects look more like state or even federal level endeavors. And I think being diligent about being educated about what that might look like, not having a biased view of that, and also thinking ahead in the stuff they do today to prepare for that world. Those are two I think stand out.
Good. And you've turned this around into an optimistic, forward-looking, constructive statement.
That's right.
As opposed to how did they mess up? So thank you for that.
Yeah, maybe I stick with the kind of...
Maybe you'll reverse the whole process. Okay.
How that was formulated. So I think it's not really sort of a missing support or missing activities, but when there are so many new initiatives to start to set up the ecosystems, I think from the private perspective, it would be extremely important that there's then the full commitment from the government side exactly for those initiatives as well, so that it's not only half a way, and you might get a couple of companies involved, maybe a university or something like that there as well, but if it doesn't form a proper ecosystem, I think then it's a sort of a lost investment there, right? So I think it's very important that wherever the support is, that it's kind of a full commitment to kind of bring it up to the targeted levels and not to leave it half the way. I think that's at least how I would see it. Okay. And I think quite frankly for this, when the support is too much, I think it's truly in my view that when they are stepping into the kind of commercial companies' turfs and start to kind of determine too much that, hey, how the business is actually being made, so that, staying out of that one, I think they for sure are at the moment and focusing on the right topics, so more on the enabling front than doing it, so that I would say that there are no practical examples of kind of doing too much, so to say.
Tommaso, I'm going to give you the last minute.
The last word, wow.
I'm going a little long here, but I'll give you the last minute.
Excellent. Well, where government could improve potentially is again in coordination. So talking to each other, both at the national but also at the international level. I was at lunch with at a kind of round table between the UK and the US, where this new big cooperation agreement has been recently announced. We saw the announcements from yesterday and today. I think that's a very good starting point. What the US could do better is to try to align with all the the allies in order to make a coherent and consistent framework to support quantum companies as well as the quantum ecosystem Miko was talking about.
Okay. And my last comment would be, you know, it's easy to sign accordances of what you say you will do. We're all watching if you actually do it.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Please help me in thanking the panel.
Thank you.